Well, here we are, continuing our discussion of language. We spent our time on Tuesday discussing the referential approach to language. I also, as I make a transition into where we are today, and we did a little bit of that last time, sort of previewing where we were going, I wanted to recall something that we talked about in the first lecture day, where I talked about what are the characteristics of a good theory. Oh, you may remember the word parsimony, and parsimony is one of those words that just might pop up on an ID as an ID option on an examination. Parsimony is that standard or that criterion of a theory that says that you ought to be able to write the essence of a theory on the back of a postcard or a letter or whatever it might be, an envelope. And I hope that I demonstrated that to some extent when I talked about the fact that referential theory, the essence of referential theory is that if we want to know what words mean, we look at reality, and we use reality to define words. And I suggested then in our transition, and I'm doing that again, that the movement between what we said there and where we're going into linguistic relativity, which is our second major theory in language and our second major theory of the semester, sort of reverses that equation. And we will find that people argue that if you want to know what reality is, you look at language. That's the reverse. If you want to know what reality is, you look at language. How much of what we are as individuals is the reflection of the cultures that we have, varied by region, by age, by gender, by experience, by religion, by all kinds of things? How much of that is translated into the language that we use in everyday conduct of our behavior? And linguistic relativists argue that all perceptions of reality are influenced by the words that are used in that language culture to describe that reality. Now, this was a theory that was largely brought to us by a fellow by the name of Kenneth Burke, but Kenneth Burke drew upon other individuals. And I'd love to read, I've done this forever and will do it now, particularly on tape, perhaps forever. On page 108 in the book, there is a block quotation, and it's by a fellow who was a linguist. Burke was influenced by these folks, Worf and Sapir. Some of you in other classes have run onto these fellows. But this one statement here to me is almost sermonic. And when I'm using the word sermonic, it has nothing to do with religious belief, but religious practice, that we sermonize by preaching a point of view. And this is sort of preaching a point of view, and I want to ask you to think about this. Human beings do not live in the objective world alone. The objective world is the stuff that we bump into, right? It's the stuff that we sense, we see, we taste, we touch. Not alone in the world of social activity as ordinarily understood, but are very much, and this is the part that I like, we are very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. Those words are carefully chosen, and sometimes the quotations that we have that I've pulled out, I've done so not only because they are right, but I think that some of these are very eloquent. Very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. We see and hear and otherwise experience very largely as we do because the language habits of our community, language habits, the linguistic relativists argue that there are lots of words here when you got here. And you jump on that bandwagon, you say, I can play that game, I know what's going on, and you take on those words, and in taking on those words, you take on an ideology, you take on a worldview, you take on a point of view. We see and hear and otherwise experience very largely as we do because of the language habits of our community, predispose certain choices of interpretation, predispose certain choices of interpretation, which suggests then that we see the world through these, we're going to call them terministic screens. Now, to what extent you believe that, I don't know. But Burke clearly did, Whorf and Sapir clearly did, and there are many other people that clearly do. Now, does linguistic relativity say that the referential theory is absolutely wrong? No, it simply says that we have to realize that with the words that we use to associate with things, that we're then imposing on those things, those experiences, some interpretation that is unique to that particular language culture. Interpretations that are unique to that language culture. And we can easily begin to see what some of these differences are. On page 109, I talk about, for instance, an experience, and Whorf and Sapir wrote about a couple where, and I believe that one of them or the other actually worked for an insurance company for a period of time, and part of his job was to go into plants, industrial settings, and find mistakes that were being made and try to correct them, because that would reduce the cost of insurance, because it would reduce the cost of accidents. Empty gas cans, people may believe are safe, as opposed to full gas cans, which people believe are not safe. The argument is that actually an empty gas can is less safe because the vapors in the gas can are still there, and it is gasoline vapor that will explode into fire, whereas gasoline itself you could use to extinguish a cigarette, unless there's a lot of vapor. It's the vapor. But we think of the full can as being dangerous, where it may be that the empty can is. Limestone is rock and won't burn. Well, the point they make is that if you have dripping acetic acid that drips onto limestone, it creates something that is highly combustible. We get into some other issues. One of the authors that I like to read is a man by the name of Tony Hillerman, who, interestingly enough, for those of you interested in journalism, is a former journalism faculty member at the University of New Mexico who got very familiar with the Navajo culture and began to write mysteries. He's an internationally known mystery writer. But what's interesting is that to understand his books, you have to understand, because he's writing about Navajos, the Navajo police officers who are able to solve the crime, because the crime is often either committed by Navajos or on Navajos, and if you understand Navajos, you understand the clues. And then he's always critical of the FBI, which is this bunch of Eastern Anglo-Europeans that show up and they don't know what's going on. They don't know what the clues are. Meaning that they don't see the world through the interpretive framework that will allow them to know what's going on. They don't know what the clues are. One of the things that's interesting is that over the years, the Hopis, and they're an interesting Native American group in the United States, they were studied. We love measurement in this country if we are operating of that sort of standard Anglo-European mentality. Yesterday I was listening, for instance, to measurements of distance. There is something called an EU, I believe, that is a measurement of distance. Some of you astronomers may know that. And it is the mean distance between the Earth and our Sun. Somebody has argued that that doesn't really give us much of a sense of distance, and they're now talking about jet years as a measurement of distance. How far can a jet plane fly at 600 miles an hour in a year? Well, we love to measure stuff. Now, if we're out on in a traditional family in the Hopi reservation, and we say to somebody, how much water is there in the glass? They look at us with absolute bafflement, because does that make a difference? If there's water in the glass, there's water in the glass. If there isn't water in the glass, there isn't water in the glass. It's a binary sort of thing. Is there anything wrong with what they think? No, it's just their way of thinking. Meat, there either is meat or there's not meat. They don't believe that measurement is an important part of the life. They also don't believe, as an example, in the ownership of property. See, that's quite different from many of us. Because we define our whole life through space and time. The bigger the house that we have, the better that we are, the more important that we are. And one of the things that happens in River Oaks is that you get wealthy and you have to go in and buy somebody's house which you tear down, and you have to build a house that's bigger. The control of space. Now some of you may say, but didn't we a few years ago hear that the Hopis sued the Navajos because the Navajos were laying claim to Hopi land? Why would they do that? Well, they don't like the Navajos. We have this stereotype sometimes that all Native Americans are like. They didn't like one another before we got here from Europe or wherever we came from. Remember, they were here maybe as much as, what, 60,000 years ago? And those of us, as my family did, that showed up in the late 1600s and the early 1700s, well, we were really pretty new to this continent, weren't we? There were well-established cultures. People were getting along nicely without somebody bringing, quote, culture to them. So there were people that said, we don't own anything, and why can't you own anything? Well, isn't that interesting? The English Bible, the King James Bible, says, in the beginning, da-da-da-da-da-da, and man, doesn't say women, does it? It says man was given dominion. Oh boy, I get to own it. I get to go out there and hire me a surveyor, and I say, this is my 21 acres. I actually only have 20.9 acres out in Carmine, Texas. My wife rounds it down to 20. I round it up to 21. Because I think that having more land sounds better. See what I'm getting at? It's a sign of success, a sign of achievement, isn't it? Well, the Navajo said, this is our land. The Hopi says, it's not your land. We're going to sue you. We don't own it either, but you're not going to own it. We're going to tell you that. Now, in the English version of the Bible, it says, given dominion, which means that we can strip mine. We can pollute. We can go out there. I don't know how many of you have ever been out in the Four Corners area, Farmington, New Mexico, and so forth, but the violation of Mother Earth by those great big coal mines out there still upsets many of the conservative Navajos. Because the Navajos believe that the earth is Mother. Now, do we run around stabbing Mother with sharp instruments? Or do we protect Mother? So we've got Mother Earth and Father Sky. Father Sky comes along and sprinkles Mother Earth. I don't want to get too graphic. But if that metaphor made sense to you, it makes a lot of sense to the Navajos. Now what happens if you upset that order of Mother Earth and water sprinkling Father? You end up with drought. You upset the order of the world. You become ill, perhaps. They don't want illness. They want to sort things out. They got to be in harmony. They are a people that want to live in harmony. The Navajo. See, they don't even believe in ownership of land. Isn't it interesting? But they just lived there, which was a sign of ownership, and so the Hopi said, you can't live there. We don't want you to be there. We want you to be somewhere else. The Navajos believe that the best lived life is to leave no sign of yourself behind. Tell that to people who endow college campus buildings. Isn't my lot in life to become so wealthy that I can have the Moores School of this, that, and the other? Or the O'Quinn this, that, and the other? Or the Cullen this, that, and the other? And the Navajo said, we don't get it. You have violated Mother Earth by assuming that you have possession of it because you don't. Now, what's the difference? What's the difference? The difference is language. And in language there is culture. The stuff that we stand on is dirt, or it's soil. I've been told by people in the soil business that dirt is under your fingers and soil is under your feet. Even they get grumpy about what we call the stuff around us. Well, you see, there we go. What is edible and what is not edible? What are the relationships between us and other people? How does all of this work out? The linguistic relativists have drawn on a variety of influences. One of those is a fellow by the name of George Herbert Mead. Some of you have studied him in other contexts. Mead wrote a wonderful book called Mind, Self, and Society. And he argues that we come into the world. He also wrote a book called The Philosophy of the Gesture, in which he tried to figure out how we come to use language and how language is meaningful to us. And his argument is something like this, that we come into the world and we are gesturing. We're doing something, right? We're doing something. And that doing may get some sort of an interpretation. What people interpret as our gesture may lead them to react to that gesture, and then we interpret their reaction to our gesture. Well, a child comes into the world, and the child has nothing better to do than to sit there and go blah, 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 all day long until maybe it gets hungry and it cries or something like that. All of that blah, 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 blah is gesturing. And all of a sudden, by almost a random kind of model, the child says, mum. And if you look at most languages, the sounds that are used in reference to mothers and fathers, mom and dad, are the easiest sounds for a child to make. I think that something like 92% of all the languages in the world, the word for mother starts with an M. It's an easy sound for children to make. It's nothing more clever than that. And mama sitting there says, oh, goody, goody, goody. Now, see, let's play this back in my case. I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois. I had the distinct honor of staying at home and taking care of our daughter while our wife was the primary breadwinner. So I would stand there all day long in front of the bassinet going, daddy, 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 because there was a competition. Does that kid get me first or her first, etc., etc.? But one of these days the kid says, daddy, mommy, all of this, and then we begin to say, you're responding to that. Now we know that sometimes we use words that we're not supposed to, and people said, don't use those words, certainly not in front of grandmother. Or you can't use those words because those words are going to lead somebody to poke you in the nose. So we learn what words are appropriate in what context. It's the taking of these on because we realize, in a sense, this is the argument that George Herbert Mead made, it's a game. It's a game. We make a gesture. Others interpret what that gesture means. They respond to us. We respond to their response. And pretty soon we've got a functioning kind of language that we can use in a predictable way. We do that because we have significant symbols. Of all of the sounds in the world, those that we know are important to us, we store away in our little memory bank and hope that we can remember them because we know that they unlock certain important things in the world for us. They're the exchange rate for being socialized. We realize that there's a shared reaction to these words. Convergence theory is a further realization of this. Co-orientation theory is a realization of this. So we have theories that build on this notion of shared recognition. Co-orientation we'll see in many contexts down the line. But if I say to you, I love you, to what extent do we have some shared understanding of what that word means? We can actually talk it over. Those of you watching Cupid the other night know that our Lisa has now sorted them out. She announced to the world. Did you get it? Well, you weren't there. She did. She picked him out. She broke one of their hearts because he thought he was in the running. Oh, you have to tune in next week. Oh, Arnold didn't make it. They recommended he run for governor, but he didn't make it. Robert, the guy from Austria, he didn't make it, right? So there we are. We want to know, what is our relationship? What is this? My wife and I today were married 38 years ago. I know you're groaning just like my wife does. Stuck with that guy for that long, right? What's love between my wife and me? And has it changed from that wonderful moment when we were first married, standing there not really knowing how this game is going to play out? Now, I have to go to a meeting tomorrow in the dean's office. I got permission. I tried to get out of it by hinting that it was my wedding anniversary, and people said, well, you and your wife could work that out. But I didn't. I wanted permission, see. I wanted somebody to say, oh, go ahead, go to, you know. And I talked to her this morning, and, you know, she said, well, after 38 years, I'd just soon not see. No, she didn't quite say it that way. But you see, what is love? Is it different between us now than it was between us some years ago? And do you think that maybe some sense of what love was different when we looked into that little basket in January of 1971 and we saw this little bitty baby that we got to take home with us? Do you think love now changes then? That all of this, what does love mean? Is it something that's sort of negotiated, co-created? It is meaningful to us? See, we even have things like, you will love me for this even though I'm pounding on you now. Or I will force you to love me, right? You love me or I will. See, what does love mean? Well, it's something that is negotiated. It's something that is co-defined. Whether my wife and I could write it down and get it equal or right, I don't know. But that's the notion of co-orientation. Do we have a similar enough definition of these terms that we can, in a sense, coordinate our activities? Yeah.
Unconditional love. I'm trying.
It's not working? Uh-oh, we've got a technical meltdown. Unconditional love, he says, has become a buzzword. Well, we like to talk about that, and my experience is that you can see it so easily with children. I will never forget going in and seeing my daughter safe and secure in her bed, sound asleep. I don't think in my mind there is anything that rivals that except for seeing two grandchildren safe and sound and asleep in their bed. And when I hear of people suffering from the problems of poverty and war and explosion and all of that, my heart really goes out to the children that do not have that period of innocence. We even talk about that to some extent in terms of media effects. To what extent should children be protected against certain kinds? This is a policy issue, but it has implications, doesn't it? To what extent should children be protected against certain kinds of programming and other sorts of experiences because of this age of innocence? To what extent do we have that privilege as a child to an age of innocence? And one of the, and you can think about this between now and then, one of the companies that I complain about is Disney. Disney gets away with G ratings when they talk about cutting out people's hearts, having cats chasing mice. Let's see, what else? Oh, Bambi's mother gets it. Other people get it, don't they? The wolves are after Bambi. My son and daughter took my grandson to Nemo as a birthday present. My grandson saw it but didn't like it because it starts off where you lose your parents. Is that a happy theme? No, I don't think that's a happy theme. Granddaughter said, out of here. 2 years old, she was out of here. She thought that was way too scary. Now, I don't think she understood the concept of losing your parents. I do think maybe the grandson does. But I remember when I was old enough to think of losing my parents, what would I do? Who would cook supper? I mean, I'm now like, what is that Jack Nicholson movie about Schwartz or something like that? He comes home, Schmidt, who's going to cook supper? I mean, who's going to get my bath? Who's going to do all these things for me, right? I think there is that age of innocence. So I don't know, but unconditional love, I think, is looking at something and believing truly that you would give your life for it. I mean, if a terrorist stood and said, it is either you, your life to me, or the life of your children or family, I would say, okay, if you got to pick somebody, me, right now, go ahead. I mean, because I really have that sort of a fondness for these folks. I thought it was also interesting, we go back and look at the heroism in 9/11, what people were willing to do to sacrifice? Was that a kind of unconditional love of some sort? I don't know. But you see, we're into this notion of meaning, and we like that notion of meaning, don't we? I think when we're children, we like to come into the world believing that we're unconditionally loved, that people will take care of us, but we also know that that can be taken advantage of, that children can abuse that, and that they then say, well, you can't punish me if you love me. You can't punish me if you love me. Now we're into the negotiation of the implications of the word love. We're going to talk about this in a moment in a slightly different way. But one of the assumptions that we make in terms of, and I'll point to it at the bottom of the transparency when it gets up, is terms as propositions. To what extent are the terms that we take on propositional? Propositional. And we'll see what that means in just a moment. Well, our old friend Kenneth Burke, building on some of the references that we've talked about before, had a really important experience when he went to an art show at a nice museum somewhere, probably in New York. He lived in and around New York and New Jersey most of his life. And this was a photographic art show. And the photographer had taken the same picture of the same objects, the only difference being that each of the pictures was taken with a different colored lens. And when Burke stood in front of those pictures that were the same except for a different colored lens, he realized that if you see reality through a different lens, reality somehow is different even though reality is somehow the same. Do you see what we're getting at there? And he then coined the notion of terministic screens, another one of those words that can pop up as an ID, right? Terministic screens, seeing the world through the culture of language. I've worried that I'm not going to find that quintessential, that really excellent example to put on WebCT to demonstrate this. And partly because it's so hard for us to understand and it's out there all over the place. If any of you said this is really the segment that works very nicely, somebody has recommended to me, it's something about work, I believe, that has Chan and somebody in it as movie characters. They have language problems. See, it's not just the language, I can't understand you because you speak a different language. It's that your language sees the world different than my language. One of the great mistakes that we make in foreign policy is that we work on the assumption that everybody sees the world as people in Crawford, Texas do. And the truth is that we don't. So part of the problem of international politics is seeing the world different. Languages are different. Well, I mentioned to you earlier in this course that there are certain religions in the world that, in my mind, they see it differently, but in my mind are dehumanizing against women. They constrain the options that women have. We saw some of this as actions and statements by the Taliban. Women would be whipped. Women could not go to school, etc. As I understand it, one of the interesting paradoxes between Afghanistan with the Taliban and Iraq with Saddam Hussein was that in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, women were encouraged to get educated. Now, I may be wrong in that, but I do know that women even went off to other parts of the world to become educated, because that educated female population was a virtue in that particular culture. But in a more conservative interpretation, women had to be properly garbed. They had to act in specific ways. It was a very carefully defined. Now, when we come to the notion of terms as propositions, to what extent do the terms that are associated with us serve as propositions on how we should act? Two babies born into the world exactly the same time, identical in many features, except for the fact one is a boy, one is a girl. At that point, can we predict what they're likely to wear to the prom? Less now. Less now, right? Less now. One of the things I find interesting is that in feminist theory, there is a tendency to encourage women to be able to act like men, being able to dress like men. is there an equal argument that men ought to be able to break out and go around in their best blue chiffon without any stigma? See what I'm getting at? Is how this works out. What are the rules of the game? What are the propositions? If I'm a teacher, I'm supposed to teach. If I'm a fireman, I'm supposed to fight fire. If I'm an emergency response person, I'm supposed to respond to emergencies. If I'm a terrorist, I'm supposed to terrorize. Words are propositional. If I'm a musician, I ought to be able to perform musically. If I'm an actor, I ought to be able to act. Words are propositional. One of the things that we do in our education is to look forward to taking on these propositional terms. I'm an accountant. I ought to be able to account. And if I go to work for Enron, I can really account. I can do super accounting. One of them went to the slammer yesterday. He said, we were accounting in rather clever ways. Whether more of them go or not, we don't know. But there's something that distinguishes these professional categories become definable by the way in which the word prescribes what actions are appropriate. If I'm a lawyer, I should. If I'm a medical physician, I should. If I should, etc., etc. We learn then to some extent to live stereotypic lives. Is that a fair way of saying what goes on? We have to share the meaning and live the life of that meaning. One of the themes that we'll talk about in interpersonal communication is to what extent we can live without stereotypes. Can we really live without stereotypes? We break the world into meaningful bundles. I think the question isn't, do we stereotype, but do our stereotypes turn out to be dysfunctional, wrong, bad? And then we get into the ethical dimension of communication. Yes? A stereotype is a very loaded word. All right. That's right. Jerome Bruner, who is a cognitive psychologist, said that we are by nature stereotypers. We break the world into distinguishable stimuli because it's too difficult every day to have to get up and relearn the world. What is edible? What is unedible? All of these kinds of things. But when we begin then to impose not only a negative stereotype, but negative behavior, and I mean negative consequences for behavior or condition, then we begin to say that's bad. But sometimes we even do that, and it's good, called criminals. We define criminals, and we say if you're a criminal, then bad things can happen to you, and if you're a really bad criminal, something really bad can happen to you, particularly in the state of Texas, and particularly in Huntsville just after summertime. Right? Some of you, then when you are picked up for speeding or running a light or something like that, do you have your propositional terms that are all set up there for you to defend yourself? What do you respond? Pregnant lady? Bad bladder? A crybaby? All of these kinds of things. See how we play it out? Then you see the foundation for narrative theory. So language culture is this sharing of significant symbols, and through it we begin to identify. Identification is when we take on the symbolic substance of these words. One of the things that I find interesting is your experiences as college students. As you go around the country and you find that somebody else is going off to college, is there a kind of identification, a kind of bond? You talk about your experiences, you compare them, it is a way of seeing yourself. I too am a college graduate. I identify with college graduates. I identify with people from the state of Texas. I identify with people from the state of Colorado. I identify with people from the United States. We come from a foreign country to live in the United States. To some extent, we still identify with the people in the country from which we came. We identify with people by religion, by race, by age, by ethnicity. We identify. Why do we do all of this identification? It's a way of sorting us into collective behavior, coordinating us, knowing what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, what was going to happen. So I think that part of this notion, and Burke talked about the rhetoric of identification, is appeals for people to say, see the world as I do, identify with me because we are the same. It accounts for how we can have political elections, don't we? Are you an Arnold supporter or are you not? Are you a Larry Flint supporter or are you not? Are you a Bustamante supporter or are you not? We get into a political rally, we carry our flags around. I'm for whoever might be, right? I identify with that. I wear my little badge. I thought it was interesting the other day that listening to the debate at Morgan State, Senator Kerry said, I am a Democrat, and he's won I don't know how many military medals, Bronze Star maybe twice, Silver Star, Purple Heart. Every time he got shot or wounded, he got a Purple Heart. A lot of times. I mean, this guy has gone into battle and gotten wounded, and that may be more than George has done, who still loves to come in with his flight suit on, right? George, where's your Purple Heart? Where's your Bronze Star? Where were you when Kerry was over there? See what I'm getting at is building up to Kerry's statement, I am not afraid to be a flag-wearing Democrat. Because it got to be that if you were a Republican, you had to wear a flag, and the flag was yours, and if you weren't a Republican, you couldn't wear a flag because you were un-American. You were anti, well, you see how we get all of this? And politics is identification. Politics is identification. Sorting ourselves out, saying this is the side of the fence that I'm on. This is the lever that I push, the chad that I create, the hanging chad that I create. That's who I am. And my identity. I was raised in a very Democrat society, family. My grandmother, for the price of ginger snaps, would set my two cousins and me down and read Eleanor Roosevelt to us. I'm always worried when I go in to vote that grandmother in heaven is still watching and someday will confront me if I make it. I know she's there saying, why did you vote for those Republicans? You knew I gave you those ginger snaps for a reason. Your identity, your identification. Well, there are people on the Republican side that have the same sense, don't they? We know who we are. We've sorted ourselves into these bundles. Words are different from reality. Words are different from reality. Burke tells us, we can carry this word thing relationship too far, that we can talk about rocks, but calling a rock a potato doesn't make it edible. Just imposing a word on something doesn't make it, if it's physical. But then he also cautions that sometimes imposing words on people make them what it is. That is the implication of the word. I mentioned earlier today as we were assembling that I would like to sit over on that corner or on that side of the room if I were you, a student. That's where I sat in the first grade. The first grade was divided, as this class sort of is, by section into 3 sections. This is farm country in western Colorado, folks. Imagine for just a moment. Those of us over here were bees. Is bee in farm country good or bad? Super good. They pollinate. This bunch over here, these were ants. Ants are not bad. In Texas, fire ants. We didn't have fire ants in Colorado and probably never will. I think they're smart enough not to live at that elevation in that cold. But they may adapt. We don't know yet. But ants. And these poor folks over on this side were grasshoppers. Now, grasshoppers in farm country are worse than anything. Well, there we were, 12 years later, going to our graduation. All of the bees buzzed right through that graduation. Most of the ants did pretty well. Not a single grasshopper made it. To what extent might it have been that kids grew up at the first grade thinking of themselves as grasshoppers that predicted what they would do? To what extent do the words that we take on as individuals, predicting who we turn out to be, predispose us to certain hopes, certain restrictions, certain reluctances, and so forth? So that in a sense, you see, we're not like rocks and potatoes. You can't make a rock edible by calling it a potato. But you could make someone a criminal by calling them something that gave them the sense that they were offensive to society. That also becomes interesting to us later on. We talk about media effects, because one of the assumptions that we make is that people will look at, process, and think about media differently based upon how it serves them to manage their identity. One of the questions that we will ask is, why do kids, teenagers, adolescents like certain programming? To what extent is it informative? To what extent does it tell them what the scripts are, how to behave, what to do, how to wear their clothes, how to fix their hair, all of that sort of stuff? Identification. Who are we? Words become interpretive frames. We see the world through these. Our thinking can be flawed to the extent that the meaning of our words leads us to flaws. Our thinking can be flawed to the extent that our words lead us to flawed outcomes. And finally, terms as propositions. How loaded is our language that allows us to be and to do certain things because of? One of the things I find interesting is how freshmen negotiate something that may be to some extent unfamiliar to them, and that is coming into an academic environment. And I'm willing to believe that most faculty members on a university are different than most of the teachers that people encountered in their high school. One of those differences is that many of us are snotty as the devil. We're arrogant to a fault. We love our titles at various times. And then sometimes it's interesting to say, well, Mr. Heath. Do I hear that neutral, or do I hear that as it could be Dr. Heath? Rank, title, all of the status elements. We then look at organizational communication and organizational culture. To what extent is the culture of a university a reflection of the language of a university that is unique, for instance, from other institutions and organizations in society? And so when you come to the university, you learn words that will help you to navigate and negotiate, because to some extent these words are propositional. But you also use them as defense words, don't you? I'm only a freshman. As if we couldn't expect any kind of reasonable, sensible behavior from you because you're only a freshman. Or what's worse is, when you're a freshman, you don't want to be thought of as a freshman. Because the truth is, there's nothing any stupider in the whole world than a freshman. I'm teasing in part, aren't I? And yet in part I'm not teasing. Because there are hierarchical differences between people. I'm a senior. You're a junior. You're a sophomore, and oh yes, you're a freshman. Now it's interesting, isn't it? What are we going to call those young women when they come here? Are we going to call them fresh men? Fresh person? We've tried for some time to figure that one out. We now like to say first year students. But you know, it just doesn't have that academic quality. So what we ought to devote ourselves to in here this semester is coming up with a genderless term that will allow us to have something that is parallel to, but ultimately designated as subhuman. That's the key too. Yes? Fish, yes. And we also refer to people coming into jail cells for the first time as fish, don't we? Right? Yes? We also, when they first come in, sometimes call them meat. For all of the obvious reasons, perhaps. Yes?
I was just wondering if society itself is going to overplay this whole genderless topic.
No, it's not for me to decide. We'll let your colleagues help you to decide that. I would say that it's difficult for us. It's something that it's not only social and social decorum and so forth, it's something that has to do with our policies. I believe that our society at the level of policy ought to be genderless and ought to be colorless. I do not think that people ought to be privileged, nor do I think that they ought to be held back because of the conditions of their birth. I say that because I have been in the presence of two very strong grandmothers. I came to admire women. I think that the Western pioneer woman myth is still very much there. It is not, in my mind, an accident that the first states to allow women's suffrage were Western states, because the woman had to make the family work in many of those states. The woman had to tame the town. So she was a very responsible being, and to what extent does she then deserve equal treatment, as opposed to the stigma, you couldn't go further? There are some very, very classic cases, somewhat even in your own families, right? At a racial level, I suspect most of you, and I don't know whether people still read Malcolm X's autobiography or not. I would hope that they still do. There's a wonderful passage in there where the school counselor tells Malcolm X that he should aspire to be, as I recall, a carpenter, because he could aspire to be a carpenter. But for a black kid from Michigan, am I right in remembering that he was born and raised in Michigan, that he couldn't aspire to be a physician? Why? Because of what we're talking about here. So I think there are times, I think sometimes our efforts at gender, androgyny and so forth have become silly. We took a chairman and we made it a chair. I still think of something that I sit on. It may be my synapses. We took postal worker instead of postman or mailman, right? Fire worker, flight attendant. So we've tried, and I think in some instances it's probably good. But we still have ways of feminizing various aspects of our society. School teachers today make less money because they're predominantly women. And there is still a stereotype in our society that seems to be totally resistant that women work for less money because they're just waiting for their husband to get rich and let them stay at home and eat bonbons and watch television. So you see, we get some really substantial implications built into our way of life and our policy and our actions that can be tied up with our language, because we act toward people based upon what these words mean. Have we gone too far? At times we've gone too far. At times we've gone silly. But we're still debating some of these issues. Last summer, the University of Michigan dealt in one way or another with the issue of affirmative action as a part of admitting students. Subsequent to that, and in my other class we talk about that Rice said we're going to use race as an indicator of admission. And there are protesters that have said Rice shouldn't do that. Rice says it's our mission. We need to make sure that we do what we can to reach out and help people to achieve some sense of dream. So I think it's an interesting, challenge to us as individuals, but it's also enormously indicative of the role that language plays in the way in which we deal with one another and what we aspire to and where we go in life and so forth. Flawed thinking often reflects flawed meanings. Terms as propositions. Let's go a little bit further. Terms as the basis of identification. Codes of social identification. We've talked a little bit about that. Yes, had a question.
The last screen never came up again.
Oh, it never came up again? Should I quick? Well, it'll be on the, but you'll never see it. Well, it'll be sequentially just before this one, right? Terms as the basis of identification, codes of social interaction, sort of what we were just talking about there. If we talk about, one of the themes that we'll get into in interpersonal communication, what are those points of transition in a relationship if you move from best friends to boyfriend, girlfriend? Or what happens if you go from romantic to best friends? How do you redefine relationship with words? And it's interesting to me, back to Cupid, you're going to get a chance to see at least one segment of Cupid, right? I guess it'll work on on WebCT. But they kept telling Robert, the guy from Austria, you just don't get it. You just don't get it, meaning you don't see what the rules are. Yeah. That's okay. Don't worry about it.
I think I speak for the class. Every time we try to take notes from TV,
yeah.
we get like a 2-second interval.
Is that right? We need to keep the screens up longer then. My picture up there is really not terribly interesting to these students. Not really interesting to me, frankly. I understand. I'm saying to the fellow back there, they are going to be on WebCT shortly, but I would say that they ought to be up a lot longer than you looking at me on those screens, okay? That's a sort of operating rule that we will work on here. I don't know how they do it with the lecture. I've seen some of the lectures on video where they're up in the upper corner and all that. I'm still happy to remain anonymous. The voice behind the transparencies or the screens. Language is enactment. We're going to see this again when we talk about enactment theory and organizational communication. We know what to do. We know how to act. We know what's going on. Customers. If we're a customer, how do we behave? If we're a seller, how do we behave? If we're, all of our life, we are in these narratives. And the words that we use in these narratives not only tell us who we are, what the role is, what the plot, what the theme is. And dating behavior is a good example of that. Why are children, adolescents and so forth, so fascinated by dating behavior as a theme on television programs and on movies? Because that is their life. Is it true that for some period of time that is their life? They think about, am I attractive? Who is attractive? How do I negotiate all of this kind of thing? Why it happens, we can only account for that in biological terms, perhaps, but to some extent sociological terms. Well, in all of this, Burke then went so far as to suggest, and this is another one of those kinds of connections between Burke and linguistic relativity and a relational theory. He said, in a society, there are positive terms, and positive terms are those that we typically know the meaning of by pointing to the thing in reality, but realizing that that thing in reality is defined by the culture of the term. Positive terms. Dialectical terms, he suggested, we only know by knowing the opposite. To understand democracy, we have to understand something that is not democracy. And I find it very, very interesting. People have gone to other countries in the world and said, the people in America talk about democracy. You want to go to America, what is democracy like? And sometimes people even talk about democracy as prosperity. Democracy is prosperity. If I go to America, I can buy lots of stuff. I can have more choices in my job. I can break out of some of the sort of stereotypes that I may be held to in my country. I have opportunities. Dialectic. We also deal with that in terms of our interpersonal terms. Openness, closeness, trust, distrust. If I say, why can't you trust me? It's first of all, you don't have evidence that I'm trustworthy, but it may be that you and I have different definitions of what trust is. You and I have different definitions of what trust is. Make a commitment. I am making a commitment. I picked up the tab. What is a commitment? Be here for 6 years. I don't know that I have that much time. Commitment. What is the opposite of commitment? You see, we only know certain terms by knowing the opposite of that term. And so we define it. We work it out. We negotiate it. One of the themes that we get into more in the next theory is that much of our conversation is devoted to the coordinated management of meaning. The coordinated management of meaning, where we work to define terms and to apply those terms onto the conditions of our relationship. The conditions of our relationship. Does love mean that when you're in a rest home suffering from Alzheimer's, I will show up and see you? Or will I simply say, wouldn't recognize me anyway, I won't show up? See what I'm getting at? That's a lot different than love when you're 5 or 4 or 3 or 12 or 21. Whether you're sober or 15 minutes before closing time. You see what we're getting at here? Dialectic. What is love? What is hate? Etc. The ultimate terms. Burke says we love ultimate terms, and if we didn't have them, we'd create them. The ultimate term to Burke is God. Ultimate terms are terms that we can do things in the name of, and Burke says that there is no greater word than God. Now the irony of it is, he also was very smart in knowing that everybody does what they do in the name of God, but everybody has a different God. I have been, and some of you as well have, I'm a Civil War battlefield buff, I'm a Civil War buff. I think there's no greater drama in American society than the Civil War. I've stood on the edge of the woods at Gettysburg looking across, imagining what it would have been like to be the first person to step out into that field marching against what we assume to still be pretty good artillery, although we hope that the fact that they quit firing means that they are busted up. Our greatest fear is they're just waiting to shoot the hell out of us, which is what happened, didn't it? But why do I step out into that field? I step out into that field because of courage, because of friendship, because of freedom, because of loyalty, because of God. And can you imagine that the night before a battle, people on both sides may be invoking God to protect them the next day? One of the things that was interesting is that men in camp would typically play cards before battles and during the downtime, but cards in those days were the mark of the devil. My paternal grandmother wouldn't allow card playing because it was the work of the devil. One of the things that was strewn onto battlefields by the men of the Union Army and the men of the Confederate Army were playing cards. You get out into that field and all of a sudden God is very real to you out there, isn't it? My dad was a combat soldier during the Second World War. We go back to the issues of gender. He was wounded twice. He heard men wounded. He was an older guy. He was 35 by the time he saw military action. He saw 18-year-old kids get blasted into smithereens with no hope of a family before them. He had left behind in Colorado a wife, 2 children. I'm a replacement part. I can tell you that story sometime, but born before the war. I replaced my brother who died before I was born. I am a replacement part. I wouldn't be here if he hadn't died. Ultimate. Why are we doing this sort of thing? My dad said one of the things that was interesting to him is that when men are wounded in combat, they never call for their father. They will call for their mother. Badly shot up, badly hurt. Mom, mother, mom. Is mother, is that really a God term in our society? Yes, maybe. No, maybe. Certainly maybe in times of war. But see, what I'm getting at is Burke argued that there were words that were above all other words. Burke also liked to play with words. He liked to draw on the board and put into some of his articles 3 words which he said in the mind of the American public in the 20s and the 30s were the same. Each of these words started with G and ended with D. He would put 3 up: G blank blank D, G blank blank D, G blank D. And the first one was gold. G-O-L-D. The next one was good, G-O-O-D. And the last one was God. And he argued that the industrial model was such that good, God, and gold go together, and the person that's got the greatest gold is the most good and the closest to God. The gospel of wealth. We have to explain our being here. We have to explain our being here. Let's just invent a God. That accounts for it. Now we can go on about our business. We can take it as a matter of faith. Is that irrational? Burke would say it's a shorthand, certainly. Just solves a whole lot of problems. Because we can't go through a life without knowing why we're here. We can't wait for science to solve the problem. Let's just create a God. And Burke's argument is, if you don't believe that, find a culture that has no explanation of creation. What's more is many cultures, and this was typical of the Native Americans, will use the name of them, like Arapaho or Navajo, as the people. And everybody else is not them, somebody else. They were sort of like the chosen ones. Yes?
I think there are cultures today that don't have an explanation of creation.
Where are they?
Maybe someplace like Sweden or
Sweden?
Germany. I mean, there are obviously religious.
All those Lutherans up there?
They're mostly atheists. I guess.
Oh, well, the atheists, we can't account for them, right?
That's a religion itself, I guess.
I understand. And the atheists then have to say that Madeline Murray O'Hara, I don't know, created the universe, I don't know. But still, there's got to be some sense of creation. Even if you just take it at the face value, this stuff was here, we're standing on something that got here by some rational reason. Where did all the stuff come from? We don't know. And some people can accept that as their faith. Other people say, well, I want to know it a little bit more secure, so I'll come up with this answer, right? But we like that notion of something that accounts for it. And I guess that even I don't know is a reasonable explanation for certain people. Is that okay?
It's the only reasonable explanation as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you're saying that we create a guide in order
Burke says we don't like the uncertainty of the explanation of why are we here and what are we standing on.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
But yet, it's hard to believe that we haven't come far enough that we can't look at it objectively.
In some instance, it's just too painful to get beyond just accepting it. Right? Just accepting it. I think it was St. Thomas Aquinas that said that the ultimate act of faith is simply to say, it is here because. So it's interesting to imagine that. But Burke's argument is then that's, isn't that a large reason for language? That out of words we can now have the explanation for all of it. For all of it. That makes language powerful. Language is not incidental to our lives, is it? Ultimate terms then. Dramatism, then Burke says, is a matter that language has more to do with action than to conveying meaning. It is the means by which we act together, we share, we participate. Burke even went so far as to focus on meaning and interpretation. Somewhere along the line he read a study that said that if a movie is particularly scary, you have to turn the air conditioning of the theater up or the heat down because people being scared generate a great deal of energy. And his argument was there is the mix of biology and symbolism, that we're experiencing fear. Some people say he got it wrong. That when I'm really scared, I get chilled. We're having a physiological reaction to a symbolic reality. It made chills go down my spine. Well, again, we can carry this on into organizations. There's a guy by the name of Eisenberg, and Eisenberg argues that in organizations, we really don't have the time, the patience to get everything right, to have everything certain, and to have an absolutely shared meaning. Eisenberg says that organizational behavior is strategic ambiguity. How do we strategically manage ambiguity? How do we strategically manage ambiguity? Would you say that your life is in varying degrees ambiguous? Yeah. You go into a company, do you want to know what is sufficient amount of work to stay here? We have faculty come to the university, they want to know what their chances of getting tenure are. What's the name of the game? You go for an audition. Ambiguity. What's good enough? What's good enough? We are a people that have to deal with varying degrees of uncertainty. Is life the strategic management of uncertainty? Do you ever know whether somebody really likes you as a friend or they're just merely telling you that you're a friend because they want to take advantage of you in some way? They want to use you in some way? What's tomorrow going to be like? What's the afternoon going to be like? The amount of uncertainty around us, we're going to see a whole theory based upon uncertainty pretty soon. In information, we're going to apply that to one of the theories of interpersonal communication. The reduction of ambiguity, the reduction of uncertainty. We sometimes confront people. Do you like me? Am I your best friend? We have other ploys, don't we? When we're little, we say, if I am your best friend, then I get to play with this item, whatever it might be. We negotiate friendship. I will pick you up on my way to work today if you will pick me up on your way to work tomorrow, and I have to trust you that you will live to that. Don't we? Deal with ambiguity. And what's interesting is that deception is full of ambiguity. Sometimes in deception we try to maximize ambiguity. Well, Eisenberg's argument is that the notion that our incentive is to be clear may be completely wrong. That our incentive may be to be unclear. In political campaigning, how much does clarity of stance on an issue count compared to some sort of ambiguous, you're close enough so that I can identify with you? I can identify with you. Do I even have to know what you stand for if I stand for you? Well, it's this sort of thing that our friend Burke and Eisenberg and Sapir and Worf and Mead dealt with. They wanted to understand ambiguity. They wanted to understand the extent to which the difference from the norm could be used to account for how words work. On page 114, I share a little bit of my own sense of this, arguing as a summary from where we have been talking about linguistic relativity to where we're going. Meaning is an expression of the ideology and unique worldviews of the people who create and live that particular language through social interaction. Is that a good definition of meaning? If you had to write meaning down on an ID, well, you say, that sounds like a contract to me. If you said it, we'll say it. That ought to be a square deal. See how this works? You make me happy, I make you happy. It's a square deal. Well, let's preview where we're going next. Remember early on I talked about regulative rules. I talked about constitutive rules. We talked about language and other action as rule-based behavior. We've hinted at that, haven't we, as we've gone along. You may have noted that certainly referential theory of language could help us to understand something about how words relate to experience. How words relate to experience. Burke carried a little bit further, talking about what he did. And then we've got a third theory coming along here. We can call it the constitutive view of language, where we really talk about language as being meaningful through enactment. Language as being meaningful through enactment. It is rule-based. Now, this allows us to address a very important question, and that is, how do we know how to use language? How do we know how to weave words together into a sentence and into a conversation? How do we know how to weave words together into a sentence and into a conversation? Well, to some extent, the sentence is rule-based behavior, isn't it? But a conversation is even more complicated, isn't it? To what extent do we have to have some sense of shared purpose? To what extent do we have to have some sense of shared purpose to be able to engage in a conversation? Why? Because we then know what the rules are relative to the achievement of that purpose. If we're fixing, that's a perfectly good word, if we're fixing to be romantic, how do we talk to one another? What are the rules? What words are appropriate? What words are inappropriate? What sequence of words? We're even going to talk later on about one of the theories of interpersonal communication having something to do with disclosure. If you and I are in a romantic relationship and you disclose, am I rule-bound to make some disclosure on my own part? Or can I say, that's very interesting. And then the person says, now tell me something about you. That happened in Cupid. And person said, I don't know. Woman said, I feel that there are barriers between us. Well, I'm sorry that you have that feeling. Why is that kind of language appropriate? Are you likely to have that kind of conversation with your dentist? You drive along in your car, you have some sense of hunger, you take a turn into a driveway, it happens to have out front of it Golden Arches or Little Wendy's or something like that. You drive up. Do you drive in and say, I've never been here before, I don't know what you do, how do I go about doing this? Well, you might. Some of us have traveled in foreign countries and found routine social behavior to be strange because they don't play the game the way we do. We drive up, somebody on a speaker that can hardly be discerned rattles something at us. We holler, number 2 with pickles, mustard, and onions. I don't want it biggie sized. I don't want cheese. I'll take a Coke. We don't go to the dentist's office and say that. Doctor says, how are you? I'll take a number 2 with cheese, mayonnaise, hold the mustard. You see what I'm getting at is that context and purpose then help us to know what of what we have going for us will allow us to do that. Now, I'm talking to you, you're talking to me. Do we have to disclose something? You're asking questions. Do I have to answer those questions? In what ways do I have to answer those questions? At some point in the semester, you may ask me what is on the examination, and I may tell you, I will tell you on Thursday. It's cute, isn't it? It's my way of saying when you get the examination, you will know the answer. I'll tell you on Friday. Well, Friday is the day after the exam. Oh, heck. I didn't know that. See, what's a joke? Sometimes, why is what you say with somebody that you like funny, and if you said that to somebody else, it would be seen as an insult, a put down? It's because we know the rules of the game. And this is the essence of our third theory. The essence of our third theory is that language is rule-based behavior, where the weaving of conversation grows out of our ability to have shared purpose, and the ability to know what conversational units, what scripts, what themes, what plots are required, what rules are required, what interpretive rules are required to accomplish that together. To accomplish that together. One of the things that we do as we try to educate you as a student is we give you opportunities to go out for something like an internship. One of the advantages of doing that is that we allow you to interview for a job and to get a little bit of experience doing that. We may even have workshops on it. You can go over to the workshops over here and play interviewing. Why is that good? Because we're getting you ready to go out and get a job so you can become really rich and endow the university. Have a building named after you. You will be immortalized. So you see what we're doing is we're teaching you the rules of the game. We're teaching you protocols. And the amazing thing is that all of the symbolic forms that we have are very similar to that. They have to be very predictable. Music is that way. And sometimes when music forms change, people say, this is not music, this is racket. I still somehow think that when I'm sitting in a car that I own, listening to the music in somebody else's car next to me, and I sound like that I'm in downtown Baghdad, boom, 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 that doesn't have musical quality to it. But if I turned up my Beethoven, people on my side would say that it doesn't, or if I turned up my George Winston, they might say that doesn't, or my Leanne Rimes, they would say that doesn't, or my Australian ballads, it doesn't. But each of these is a different set of rules, isn't it? It's a different game. Football is different from basketball. Well, we're going to sort that out. You can tell me a lot more when we get together next time.
Thank you.